Good morning, everyone. We continue with the second session of this morning. Well, this is the afternoon already. After the two first interventions, first by Finasula, who gave us an overview of different initiatives at an international level of the importance of preserving documents related to sport activities and, well, many other activities related to sport, and then about the very interesting personal experience and professional experience of Albert Llobera. And, well, I complain that I have a bit of a cold, and, well, just go and figure. As he says, we'll try to take advantage of opportunities and continue moving forward. We have two speakers until 2 in the afternoon, if we have like a previous discussion, who are Dr. Xavier Pujadas and Dr. Xavier Oliver. Both of them are doctors, but from different disciplines. We're going to start by introducing the first, and after the Xavier Pujadas intervention, I will introduce you to the other doctor. So, Dr. Xavier Pujadas, Between Memory and Oblivion, will be given by Dr. Xavier Pujadas, who's a doctor in contemporary history, and in the early 1990s he initiated a line of research on the social history of sport in Catalonia and studied until that time. With Carles Santacana, he published reference works such as the Other Olympic Games, Barcelona 36, published in 1990, and 2 volumes of the Illustrated History of Sport in Catalonia, 1994 and 1995, and Sport is News, a history of the sports press in Catalonia from 1880 to 1975, published in 1997. So here it is obvious the different types of documents when writing about these contributions that have a historical view. In 1998, he began his academic career at the Ramon Llull University, where he taught the history of sport and set up the 2002 Research and Innovation Group on Sports and Society. He is a specialist in sport of the first third of the 20th century. He has published in international journals and has coordinated, among other texts, the Metamorphosis of Sport, 2010, and Athletes and Citizens, a social history of sport in Spain, 2011. He chaired the Spanish Association of Social Research Applied to Sport and is a member of the European Committee for Sports History. And just by reminded myself that we have simultaneous translation, so let's try to speak a bit slower than I have. So thank you very much. I will try to speak slowly, and I will try to make it light so that we respect time until 2, because both Dr. Oliver and myself, we would very much like to have a discussion at the end and to listen to your questions or whatever comments that you hear about in this first seminar on archives and sport. So it is a great pleasure for me to be here today, sharing with you, well, who are people who work on the world of archiving or the preservation, in fact, of the heritage and historical memory about sport, or that you are studying. Welcome to the students from the University of Girona who are present here today. And today that I was supposed to give class today, I'm going to do it here. So I will try to give like a class. So thank you very much for inviting me to this talk, and I will try to give you a set of systematized and a structured set of reflections that would stem, I would say, from 2 initial confessions on my part before I start giving you the content of the speech or the lecture. First of all would be that it is a set of reflections made from the point of view of history. So from a very specific perspective, as a historian, as the historian that I am. So we are users, we are not the only one, we are users of archives, of collections, of different sources, but we are some of the main users of this type of documents of heritage or documentary heritage. Today's lecture will be reflections made from this perspective. It couldn't be as it couldn't be otherwise. It has been said at the presentation that some of the things I'm going to tell you about stem from my experience as a historian and from my contact for almost 30 years with the world of archives and collection, and how this job of sport historian has been transforming itself in an absolute way for 30 years. And this has a very direct relationship with these kind of sources and documents that we work with and the ones we need to work with. It was not the same 25 or 30 years ago than today, because the discipline has changed. There are students here from the subject history sport. This subject was very similar to traditional historiography, more positivistic, and the history of sport as it is dealt today, it is social and cultural history that takes into account an amount of documents and archives and files that are very different and diverse. So, as it is very much linked, one thing to the other, archives also have to be able to meet the needs of professionals who work on research, of historical research, and historians have to take into account the way the collections are structured. So this could be like the first point of view that has to be taken into account, the first confession. The second would be that for this lecture, I've taken into account a holistic view, very general, of what I understand by memory or heritage. That's why, the title is between memory and oblivion. This is like a metaphor. I'm not talking about historical memory, which is another discussion altogether, which is like a very political one, and in our country, as it has happened in many other European countries in the last 40 or 50 years, is very much in vogue and being discussed. But from a metaphorical point of view, between memory and oblivion, between memories and history, and the lack of preservation of this history. This is what I mean with this title. This is at the point when I think we sport historians find ourselves in general. I'm saying it also because of those people who are in the room who are not Catalan or Spanish. Here we've been for many years, from the history of sport history, everything was very bad, in a bad shape. Then when you go out and you participate in international congresses, you realize that from the perspective of sport archives, it's like the same problem. They have the same problem everywhere, that they aren't as they should be, with the exception that have already been mentioned from countries in Northern Europe, which, well, we envy them very much. But in general terms, this is not what happens everywhere else. So it's also a lecture from this point of view, in a general view. I'm not speaking about Spain or Catalonia or Southern Europe, but in general, I'm talking about sports and archives in general. So, in order to do that, I'll try to structure it and basically to start from 4 different aspects, 4 topics. The first, and well, you allow me to do like that, I think it's impossible to evaluate and to be able to make serious proposals, which is what I would like to do here, in order to discuss them afterwards, which is the situation of archives and historical heritage, not only archives, of sports, without seeing what it means for the present and for the future, studying and therefore preserving the memory of the past. If we don't make this exercise, it's going to be very difficult to assess accurately should we preserve the history of sport. We could, just not do it. In fact, we haven't done it for many years. In fact, the historical awareness in many sport clubs, federations has been non-existent or almost non-existent. And I'm telling you with the knowledge of the cause, up to very recently, 90% of sport clubs didn't have any archives. They didn't have any archivists, and very often the same with sport federations. Or they had like a room that you can imagine, and in a corner in a building or wherever in Barcelona, for instance. So we have to ask ourselves, why do we want to preserve? Because these are like public funds and private funds. This means a lot of money that we could be spending otherwise. Why do we want to do it? I mean, this is like an essential question I would like to respond today. So this would be like the first topic, sport and history, preserving what for? Or preserving what? And what for? Second topic, this metaphor is like the metaphor, the past, the heritage, from a holistic point of view. I would like to say it from the very beginning. I'm not only talking about archives, I'm also referring to architectural heritage, and not catalogs or cartography. And well, we talk about the importance of this section of the ACA, of the architectural archives, which is essential also for the history of sport. When, what, and why stadiums have been built that have changed the shape of our cities. Knowing that requires the knowledge of the process of this building, the economical projects and architectural projects that are behind this building. But also the sport memory is also a material memory, tangible. So what happened with the Orthodrome of Terramar, which is one of the best in Southern Europe, that is like abandoned? What happens with the Velodrome in Mallorca, which has been catalogued but is not being bought, and we don't know whether it is going to be bought? And we have the history of this. What happened with this heritage, with this velodrome, as I was saying? So we could talk about the different documents, but currently sport historians need to have access to a very diverse amount of sources of information. And let me give you just to after the passionate explanation of Albert, I mean, I haven't kept anything he said. He confessed, I haven't. Please keep archives. This is very typical of sports people. I mean, I keep my individual memory, my particular private memory, which is what they have lived through with passion and force and strength, but not a general awareness of what their profession means for society. I said, I haven't kept anything. This is not true, because he has kept two things that are essential for historians in the future. Images, both the graphical image is essential to recover how sports were practiced 80 years ago, and memory. Memory means the oral source, the possibility we have to record this memory from the main players, and after 50, 60 or 70 years they won't be here and we won't have a direct direct account. So these are also sources for the memory of sport. So which are the generators of this memory? And thirdly, Oblivion, just to close the circle. What have we done wrong and why? Why for so many years, and which consequences it has had to preserve this memory and to be able to interpret it and reconstruct history after all. And you'll see what are the double oblivion and why oblivion, and then two other aspects that we could just have turn into one, which are reflections on possible strategies for the preservation of this memory that we have forgotten so many times, and specific actions about how to materialize these strategic actions. Well, so let's get started on the first aspect, the first topic, sport and history. Very quickly, we would say that sport historiography, the job of a historian, has transformed in the last 3 decades, basically, especially from the decade from the 1980s up to now. We can say that there are two big moments that could mark this transformation. The first stage from 1960, after the Second World War, and the second half of the 20th century to the 1980s, when there we see the emergence of sport historians who incorporate, both in the US and Canada especially, and also in Europe, who incorporate a social perspective to write the history of sport and forget this positivistic and more descriptive, more traditional way of what was or how we made history. And well, there are very important people who started published at the end of in the 60s and 70s, like Alec Goodman. So it's a new way. They do the history of sport differently, and this will affect documents and sport archives and the preservation of this memory and this heritage, because they pay attention not only in results of competition, but they also pay attention to the social and cultural context around it. So any individual or citizen who participates in the sport phenomenon, they use the word of sport phenomenon, is important or might be important to preserve this memory. So interviewing a hooligan or a fan or a follower of a team, of a sport team, can give us very valuable information of the emotions through which the sports practice is experienced from the point of view of spectators. And well, this was non-existent and noticed in the first half of the 20th century. So this change of perspective, changed the way of writing the history of sport, and it also changed the way of documenting. This was an important transformation. And the next one is the one that reaches us up today, from the 80s, the second half of the 80s, up to now, where this becomes institutionalized, and sport historians, this means more resources, more projects, more research projects, enter universities, and they start enlarging or expanding the departments of history, sports science, and history, especially in these departments, and they start to proliferate new academic perspectives with research projects, more publication, more journals, more congresses, more international congresses. So this makes this led the modernization of history of sport, and also the access to archives was different. The sport history, from the point of view, is transformed into a social and cultural phenomena, and it is seen as such, not as a minoritary practice of a few, like for instance in this race in the city of Girona, or like the history of sport starts to be considered a social and cultural phenomenon which explains or helps us to explain our own society. But there's something that currently I think that most we've shared that in many congresses. Most sport historians have very clear now that we explain the history of sport not because we like sport. I mean, we might like it or not. In particular, I do like it, but this is different altogether. But because we are convinced and we know that by explaining the history of sport today, we are explaining history. We can't explain the history of our society, of our societies, without explaining the history of sports, because it has become a social and cultural fact of the first magnitude, which develops a very important part of 90% of citizens, at least of Western countries, let's say, and of other countries as well. So, explaining the history of sport is explaining our own history. So, preserving. So we start to see like the answer to the question I was raising at the beginning. So, preserving the sources of information, documents, archives, etc., is preserving our own history. It's not preserving a minor thing, a second-class thing. It's preserving history with a capital H. So, from this perspective of social history, very recently, very soon it will be 50 years of the Mexican Olympic Games in 1968, the unfortunate Olympic Games, which had the first repression in October in 1968, explaining the history of Olympic Games, explaining the political history of Mexico and of the Western countries as well, of the decade of the 60s or the 70s, etc. This is also working on sports history. So the history of sport allows us or helps us to reconstruct our own history when we think about sport as a social phenomenon, and not like what Elias was saying, a total social event, and not as a minoritarian activity from a sector of society, which is what happened, around 1850s or 1880s, but not nowadays or from the last half of the 20th century. Why preserving the history of sport? Because it means knowing our societies better and knowing how we play in modern societies, how we relate to each other, how do we feel emotions in front of sports activity or within the sports activity, how do we show publicly ourselves in a stadium or outside a stadium or around a sports event, how do we build identities, how do we discriminate each other, and how do we treat each other. So the good and the not so good about our own societies. How do we educate? How do we cooperate? How do we fight? How do we think? How do we win? And how do we lose? By reconstructing all of this, by having access to the sources, documentary sources, we can reconstruct a very important part of our own past, and therefore we can, and by knowing how it was, this past, undoubtedly, well, this from a popular perspective or from a sport or elite sport, we can assess the sport we play in the present better and transform, if necessary, if the administrations also deem it necessary, and societies, to transform our sport models towards more egalitarian models, more diverse models. Well, we've heard Albert's experience just now. More inclusive models from the point of view of gender, or more solidarian models, more fair. So, in summary, sport towards a more like a tool for change. Sport can also be a means for change, because if it has an effect, an impact in society, and if almost everyone participates in sport, sport has a strength, a capacity for transformation that is very, very big, which is bigger than we might think. And this has been so, and it has been just like that for a long time. So by knowing the history of sport will allow us to know about the capacity we have to change society through sport. So let's go to memory. What memory? I defend, I also said it at the beginning, more generic, more general and holistic view. I'm not only talking about written or about text. I think that Fina also mentioned that at the beginning in her intervention. The history of sport, social and cultural history of sport, requires a huge amount of different sources. So it has to be a more general perspective, a more holistic view when we talk about what kind of memory and which memory exactly, which kind of document, which kind of sources are the ones that support our job, our task of research, of scientific research based on documentation and the interpretation of these sources. So which memory, therefore? In this sense, we can have different types. I've had into account like 9 or 10 aspects, different aspects. Some of them are more classic, others not so classic. Like the public documents gives us a very important information, valuable information that refers to the public administration that from the 1920s more or less, grosso modo, from the second or third, from the 20s or 30s, started playing a fundamental role in the development, in the standardization and legislation, the legal framework or institutional framework with sports policies, etc. So it's been almost a century of sport policy. So public information is essential to understand how modern sport has developed in our societies. Private documents, of course, I mean modern sport is the club, is made by the club, school and clubs. So documents referring to sports clubs or sport entities, federations, all the institutional network, schools, referees, competitions, professional leagues. So we could have a very, very long list of examples generating sport memory, and that should be responsible to preserve this memory in order to do research with them. And the graphical image, it's also essential because in part it depends on the perspective we work on. I mean, the history of sport is basically movement. Of a very important part of sport is movement, and the capture of this movement through the graphic image is very important. And also because from the year 1924, more or less in the in-between wars period in Europe, the camera, the photo camera, started to be more independent with the new technologies and that can be carried around. So we have a great amount of photographs, of sport photographs, not only for professional sports, but also for amateur sport, family sport, etc., of tourism, sports tourism. And this is a very, very important source that can be replaced by anything else. And sports press, you have to think that currently sport historians in a very high percentage work with the press, in sports press. And the sport historians who work with the 20th century. So given the fact that we have important shortages of information from archives because they have not been preserved, because they have been kept, so sport historians have a source that has been kept because it was a public source that was kept in public archive, which is the press. So it is one of the most important sources for sports history. Oral sources, this is another discussion from historiography, but oral sources are very, very important. And thanks to some projects that have taken into account the recording of oral accounts, we've been able to preserve the memories for many years that otherwise would be lost. Very often, because these sports people remained invisible. So we didn't have any publications about themselves. They had to explain. And unless you record it, it was impossible to preserve. Material sources. Sports is not only people, but, well, it's mainly people doing activities, but there are also materials and equipment that give us very rich information to know how sport was played in the past, or buildings, or at least the catalogs. We don't have a catalog of buildings or sport facilities in our big cities, in our large city. In general, we don't have it here. We've tried in our research group to open a line of research about it. And what we have started to do, well, we've seen that there are very few countries that have public catalogs of sport facilities. They are lost. Most are lost. But if they are catalogued, at least we would have like some kind of trace of it. Many of them have been lost forever. And also audiovisual sources. In this seminar, we will also talk about television and preserving TV images, art, also the artistic representations of sport. For instance, advertising, posters, poetry, and literature.
In this way, we have memory generated. The archive professionals already know about this, particularly those that work with archives and sports. But we have this perspective of sport as a social phenomenon. And those that create memory are different entities that very often we don't take into account. For example, the sports clubs and the federations, private institutions as well. And we have the development of public sports policies, and we also have the media and the memory also of the athletes and of the reporters, mediators, and the industry. The industry of sport is absolutely fundamental, particularly from the 20th century onwards, and the supporters, the support associations, sports support associations, supporter association. Here we have some supporters, in fact, some British supporters from London. And what has happened? There's no doubt that for many years this historical memory and these sources of information on sport haven't been treated properly, have been lost. And this is what I call this fact of forgetting information, also the lack of historiographic tradition that the sports entities haven't preserved their own memory. So we're talking about oblivion. And this is also due to the lack of a strong tradition of historiography. Because for many years, sport wasn't considered important for history. It was just considered as a set of activities that form part of just a small part of society and that had no importance as heritage, as the heritage of the world. And then it also depends on the nature of the sport itself, because very often sport has as its main goal to have a registry of their competitions and successes, but not of the history of their institution. And any sports historian will tell you that very often we find a registry of all the competition results, but we find it difficult to find information about the economic, social life of the sports entities, and also the nature of these sports entities, because very often they have been living in this schizophrenia between sports and culture, not everywhere, but in some countries. And society has led them to behave in this way, because there are some sports institutions that have preserved their own history and have been very interested in doing so. For example, the trekking associations, hiking associations, particularly, for example, in Catalonia, there were these hiking clubs, and there was this more romantic view of the sport of hiking. However, the sport clubs, the British sport clubs that were involved in competitions weren't so interested in preserving their own history. And of course, there's also a lack of resources, not just economic resources, also economic resources. But in this country, we have many sports clubs, but many are small and have limited resources. And then we also have the leisure objective of the sports club that don't have this cultural dimension. And in short, there is this lack of awareness of history. So we have this oblivion, this loss of this heritage of history, of memory itself. And sometimes it's a double oblivion in the case, for instance, of female athletes, because there is a lack of records of sports in general, but even more so in the case of female athletes. And there are many records that have just been lost from the very beginning or have not even existed. And that's why verbal records are so important. We heard before how at Manchester City there is a project for having this verbal recording of the experience of female athletes, and very often in the case of women, the media haven't been supporting their activities or following their activities. And then we have popular sports, or the sports of the working class, the invisibility of the working classes. The working class has been practicing sport as well, but they have been less visible than other social classes. The same is applicable to certain ethnic minorities, and we need to work harder to recover their own history, their own memory. The same applies as well to athletes with disabilities, as we heard before, or LGBTI athletes, and also minority sports. And when we talk about heritage, when we talk about memory, when we talk about preserving this memory and recovering this historic heritage, we should also bear in mind when we plan a project to recover this memory, we also have to pay attention to those groups that have been most subject to oblivion, and this oblivion is harming the historians and the sports clubs and the federations and the public institutions and the athletes themselves, because it's their own memory. But I would say as well that when we talk about trying to develop policies and initiatives to recover this memory, we should go further beyond the stakeholders. We should think that it's also affecting society in general and the history of society. That's why we can say that the recovery of this memory and the preservation of this memory and its systematization is absolutely key for our present and for our future, for the future of our society, taking into account the perspective of sport that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. We've already heard about some of the strategies in place for the preservation of this memory, but we need to promote it even further so that we raise awareness among the different stakeholders. We need public policies that help raise awareness. Some have already been implemented in some countries, but we need to encourage them and promote them further. I do believe that we need to work in the training of the sports institutions. Many of the sports clubs, many federations don't have any archivists, properly trained archivists, to carry out this task of preservation. It's also necessary to develop local policies that also raise awareness of the local identity through the sports clubs. We're talking about local entities, regional entities, and it's also necessary to have some specific research through more university research, and we also need to have a science on sports archives. We do need competitive research projects and R&D projects, because with every R&D project, R&D and IT project, innovation project, we have more possibilities of creating new archives through the recording of the verbal memory. And for this we need competitive projects, international research projects. And to conclude, I would propose the following. Firstly, that we can carry out specific actions based on the strategies that I have mentioned. And for example, I would also say that if I had to choose three aspects, I would start with the importance of networks and partnerships. The ICA SPO section is an example, the alliance, the partnership between ICA and CASH. And there are other institutions that could also be part of a network, and we need networks that are strong to be able to put some pressure on the administration to put some pressure on the public administrations and also on the private administrations so that they devote resources, they allocate resources to the preservation of this sports memory so that we have specific plans to have better sports archives. And finally, I would propose to develop an international project, and this I think can be done through the EU projects. An Erasmus Plus, for example, would be interesting. It would be good to have a project with 3 or 4 countries involved where the cash and the ICA and where the public administrations and public archives of these countries would be involved to have to be able to carry out some of these projects, and the Erasmus Plus initiatives could help in this way to preserve this sports memory. Thank you.